Okay, I'm going to throw a little human into your science here for a minute and play a little devil's advocate on the metrics. So, as a leader who is managing a team, marketing, sales, all these departments, who needs to, we need to hold people accountable to make sure we're hitting success points or whatnot. However, on the other side of it, here's all the data and science we have, but let's say that you as a SDR, you're doing your part. You've got all the data, you've got all the metrics that back up what you're doing, but you have a salesperson who can't close, or you have a marketing team that is not providing you with the right assets, or whatever it might be. At what point does human behavior and other team members come into play? And as leaders, do we have to really look at the 3D larger puzzle of saying that the metrics are are skewed because of we need to make an adjustment?
Uh, it- oh my goodness, yes. Breakout podcast is going to be about 3 hours where we talk about this variable, because at the end of the day, startups are a collection of humans.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I think in the SaaS industry, at least the traditional SaaS industry itself, there is this overwhelming culture of feeling as though we are all special unicorns, as in we are all uniquely capable of doing extraordinary things. Part of that ethos is important because at the end of the day, startups are very, very heavily risk oriented ventures, more so than a standard corporation is. Like, you have to believe in the unknown. What that often creates, however, is some cultural dynamics, some behavioral dynamics that I feel like we have seen, or anyone listening to this, if you've been part of those different families that I talked about at the beginning, if you've seen stuff happen on multiple teams, you kind of understand bits of what I'm talking about here. It's, to give a specific example, in sales development, oftentimes sales development leaders are frustrated because of that hierarchical system that can exist, where sales development is seen as being more novice, therefore in leadership structure to closing. So sales leadership to marketing leadership, of course, to engineering and product. And we get frustrated because we can source leads that are, by all accounts, awesome. So that ICP criteria, check, it was met. We met all the qualification criteria that we had control over. And then when we pass on the lead, the account executive starts getting loud and saying things like, this person wasn't qualified. Therefore, the implication being that if their close rate goes down because they're taking on more outbound leads, which, long story short, that's gonna happen. Outbound leads are harder to close. They can point to the sales development team, and because of that hierarchical system, they can be thrown under the bus. Or it's certainly true vice versa. Like, it can be true, of course, that SDR teams, depending on their compensation models, can be incentivized to throw spaghetti at the wall, where those folks have no chance in hell of buying. That's a problem too. To broader things, the stuff that we talk about at lunch and at happy hour, kind of off camera, if you will, we all do this, the spicy stuff that happens where so-and-so leader did something that is remarkably, in our eyes, not smart. A lot of it's ego-driven. A lot of it's that unicorn assumption that I am the God's gift to XYZ function. At the end of the day, I think it takes a bit of humility, and at the end of the day, that pattern recognition for me has gotten me a long way. So I describe some of this as, if you're familiar with, and I know we talked about this, Ashley, familiar with the old English wise tale, the Canterbury Tales, different personalities on a team. You see those personalities over and over and over again, and you have to learn how to work with them. You have to learn how to speak their language. It is political, it is psychological, but that's part of the game too, particularly when you don't have power at an organization, like oftentimes consultants, fractional folks. Yes, sales development leaders don't. So we have to fight for that, but often do that in ways that are, of course, tactful and tasteful and aren't going to get us into trouble.
I'm glad you brought up the compensation part. We're gonna do a whole nother podcast just on that part, because I think the compensation of all salespeople and marketing people and whatnot are a huge part of the metrics, and also part of the downfall, right? Because if you don't have a proper comp plan, or for example, I have some colleagues who, yes, you should be getting better every year, you should be selling more every year, but they're almost making it unattainable so that they're not successful, can do more harm than good, right? Like, you want your team to be successful, you want everybody to feel good about what they're doing, but that is definitely something you and I could probably talk about in another 2 hours worth of podcast. So let's get into personalization. And I think that, recently we've been watching events shift a little bit, which is good and bad, right? Like, I think sometimes we often, in every organization, we look at how can we change, how can we get better, and sometimes you got to go back to the basics, right? What worked and what is meaningful. And you've touched on this a little bit throughout the other conversations, but personalizing what you do with somebody can go a lot farther than sometimes your cold call types, right? And in the event side, we're seeing right now that larger conferences, and even if it's at a large conference, that you need to kind of break it down a little bit and let people be able to network very specifically, or do smaller dinners, craft things a little bit different so that people really feel like they are getting more value out of their time that they spent with the people around them. Kind of like, the old saying of like, business is done on the back nine of the golf course, right? Like, that's not with 100 people, 1,000 people. That's with like, what, 4 people? I think. I don't golf, but like, I think that's, how many people you're with, and business gets done and then you move on your way. Well, that's a very useful amount of your time, versus like going to a super large event where you might not meet, maybe 1 or 2 people that are of value because there's just so many. So when it comes to personalization, how do you even do that when you're doing outbound?
Well, let me just double, triple underline what you're talking about from the 30,000-foot level for a second. People are burned. They are burned. They are exhausted. There is a lot of existential dread out there. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on, but you can look globally and think to yourself, wow, this world's in a pretty tough spot in many ways. And I think what that translates to as a human experience, and therefore a prospect experience, is one of being thirsty for genuine experiences, ones that are fulfilling, ones that are not seen as mass market, and certainly not ones that are part of another era. An era being, in my line of business, it's the era of mass emailing. That's really pretty much, for the most part, over. You need to, yes, understand who your prospects are. Some of this is very technical. And so I talk a lot about activating data waterfalls. And again, if you are anybody who types in the word sales development or follows some sales development leaders on LinkedIn, there's an overwhelming chorus talking about the role that deeply unpacking what a company is and who a person is, right on down to psychographics, to everything, every bit of information you can imagine, and mashing those sources together to get a single source of truth of who the hell these people are. That unlocks your ability to be genuine. So there's a certain irony in this, because what I just described are purchasing oftentimes and always, by the way, key learning here, always purchase multiple data providers. Do not just rely on one, because different data providers provide a different piece of the puzzle. It's kind of like a Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlap. There's stuff in the middle, but there are certainly unique things that different data providers can do for you. So everything from certain platforms being better than others at understanding the graph analysis of how your company relates to other companies, basically creating similar to profiles, so understanding who your competitors are, or competitors or your customers are, right on down to some of the data itself. There are still providers that are extraordinarily better at sourcing good emails than others, good actual contact data. If you do not invest in those technologies, you are shooting yourself in the foot, because what happens is you end up being more mass market. What happens every time is, in a world where you do not shine light on all the data sources you can possibly find, you are cutting corners and having to send out more emails, having to spend more time cold calling people, doing more actual sending of activity in a way that degrades the experience, yes, decreases your conversion rates, but at the end of the day, removes yourself from this trend that both of us are talking about. People want to be spoken to in a way that's genuine. That does not mean I'm looking at their LinkedIn profile and just saying something like, hey, I see you went to this school. I went there too. Let's talk. It's not that superficial anymore. It's, I'm reaching out to you right now because of this particular time and space that you're in. It's towards the end of the year. I know budgeting season is happening right now. Looking at your company's financials, if it's a public company, which you can do, I see that your priorities are X, Y, and Z. Here is a piece of content or an event that you can go to that you would really benefit from. You're kind of being warm towards them. You're treating them as a human and not an object. But the trick of this is doing it at scale. The trick of this is not just doing it to one person. The trick is to do that across many, but in a way that balances the right amount of activity with quality. And that is the magic that you want to unlock. Because if you're just talking to 5 people, it's not good enough. You need to figure out how to do this at a reasonable amount of scale in order to be successful from an outbound perspective.
Okay, and to that point, the hot topic right now is AI and all the different tools that are out there. So when it comes to like technology, and automation, how is IA transforming like what you do? Are there any specific tools or platforms that you're using, excuse me, that other people might want to take a look at? Are there, downfalls about AI? Are people relying on it too much? Um, what are you seeing? What are the trends that you're seeing right now?
This topic has always existed to a certain extent. So there are tools that have existed for a very long time to do predictive things, to certainly surface prospects in a way that gives you some crazy insight about them that only a very advanced computer model could give you. I'm thinking like back in the day, and this still exists. So Reggie AI, that platform allowed you to go on LinkedIn and see someone's personality profile. They were very early on in developing some of these technologies. Of course, since then, there's so many more. In fact, the stack, again, is exponentially ballooning with these tools because, as you can imagine, AI as a segment of SaaS is just ballooning. It's where a lot of the funding's going. It's where a lot of the focus is. Frankly, it's sexy stuff. It's stuff that everyone likes to make assumptions about, oftentimes that aren't true. One of the strongest in my industry is the assumption that AI will replace humans. Long story short, good luck. Good luck replacing actual good SDRs with AI bots, unless there are very, very specific circumstances and you're replacing only one bit of that sales process. And now, here's the thing. At the same time, AI can be very, very powerful in doing certain things that we couldn't do before. So, frankly, getting back to that example of AIs replacing humans, I don't think that's going to happen, partially because of that race to genuineness that we've been talking about. AI cannot replicate the serendipitous stuff that happens at a happy hour event. AI cannot replicate the deep human conversation that a very experienced, very high quality SDR can have over the phone. It can't do that. But what it can do is get rid of some of the annoying stuff, like the data waterfall architecture. It's trying to find tools that connect all this stuff together. One of the most popular right now that I was lucky enough to experiment with early on when it was still in beta is Clay. So Clay is a tool that has blown up similar to Salesforce, almost to its own category of SaaS. It's become a need to have across teams to the point where you look at job descriptions. It literally lists Clay knowledge as a need to have for anyone who's in a manager or even SDR role. That tool, it's just a table of information that combines multiple sources of information together. It is the waterfall. It's saying, I want to find a list of 100 prospects. I want to enrich it across these 10 different things. Those things can be like, I want to understand the 3 major aspects of their career as it relates to my product. It can overlay OpenAI, so ChatGPT on top of it, so you can run advanced prompts. And then you can have this waterfall where prompt A feeds into prompt B, feeds into prompt C. It does some really cool stuff. But that's just one tool. And here's the thing. That tool is a table of information. You still need to understand who your ICP is. That data still needs to pipe properly into your CRM. Your activation of that data still needs to apply all of those laws of physics we talked about earlier. A human being still needs to execute many of those sales activities. I'll tell you right now, if you assume that tool, Clay alone, is going to solve your problems because you can send out 1,000 super amazing, perfectly highly personalized emails, good luck, because deliverability still exists. It is a tool. These things are tools that can make things more powerful. And the biggest lesson I can instill in anyone listening is this. When it comes to tools, if we are talking about it now, people are doing it already, and that playbook becomes saturated. So all that sexy thought leader stuff you read on LinkedIn, oftentimes that stuff has already been played out. It's in your inbox. It's in your colleagues' inbox. It's in everyone's inboxes. People are sick of it already. You need to always be ahead of the curve. Oftentimes that means doing things very differently. Oftentimes that involves the need for expertise, or else those amazing Clay tables that you developed mean nothing because everyone's doing it and your prospect is gassed. They are ignoring every email. They're not answering their phone because a million SDRs and their brother or sister are making the exact same calls. That is the challenge of sales development. It's the challenge of, I'm sure, in your world, actually pulling off a great event. It's how do you do something that other folks aren't quite doing as well? You always have to be ahead of the curve.
Yeah, there's some critical thinking that needs to happen. There's, even when you look at a CRM, the best ones out there, if you don't have someone actually making sure that the information's inputted or being analyzed correctly, then it's a useless tool, right? There's always someone. It's like going to Home Depot. They've got all the tools, but if you don't know how to use them or then it doesn't work. But this is a great segment into the hiring aspect of SDRs and your team and everything that you want to be able to do with all these tools and lead generation and all this stuff. What does it look like in hiring? Because you're really good at being able to do an analysis of somebody and whether or not they will make a great SDR, even if they are lacking in some skills that you can identify really quickly what you would need to do with them to make them a great SDR. Tell us a little bit about like how you analyze someone before hiring.
Yes, and I think SDR itself is a very interesting place to apply some of these learnings because SDR itself as a field has grown dramatically. If you think about the evolution of sales development, it used to be those inside sales teams at Oracle ADP making some phone calls. That's been going on for 20 plus years. There's been an exponential growth in SDRs because a lot of startups got funding prior to COVID and they needed to sell stuff. A lot of those folks are now leaders in the space where they themselves are trying to now start architecting functions. Um, there's been a lot of development in this area, and a lot of those tips and tricks come from, frankly, having failed many times before at the hiring process. There are so many people you can hire today, partially because all those folks I just talked about, many of which don't have jobs anymore,
Mm-hmm.
because of the post-COVID funding meltdown. And there are a few fundamentals that apply to sales development and frankly apply to other functions as well that I implore everyone listening to at least try to get right. The first and I think most important is understanding who is stage appropriate for whatever role you're trying to hire. I don't care if it's sales development. I don't care if it's engineering a product. I don't care if you're hiring a freaking CEO. You need to make sure the person in the seat has solved that particular challenge before. And let me give you an example. I've worked for a huge company in the past that's been doing its stuff a very long time, very good at what it did, very successful. And they were trying to do something new. It was kind of like a startup within a giant company. There were some decisions made about hiring folks who checked many boxes from a traditional career perspective, but didn't solve the challenge of scaling a startup before. They did indeed struggle. It's not the case every time because some of this does come down to the individual, which we'll talk about in a second, and how to kind of figure out if they're the right fit. But oftentimes, frankly, it's pattern recognition and
Mm-hmm.
it's looking at someone's resume and asking yourself the question, have they been in that seat before? Have they solved the problem? Have they put on an event like yours before? Have they created a team at your stage before? So for me, it's like greenfield, as in you've never evangelized your product through outbound channels before, is a lot different from I have endless amounts of inbound and I'm trying to optimize it. Have you solved those problems before? And then there's a human being at the other end. So we look at the resume and then we try to figure out, okay, who is this person? Are they a fit for the role? From an SDR perspective, the evolution, let's say pre-COVID and post-COVID, has gone from it being green. I'll give that away to anyone listening who's like, yeah, SDR, it's a green function. Kind of, sort of was in the past. Although I'm a strong advocate for sales development and leadership, partially selfishly, but partially because to get all this right, you need to have done it many times before. That was true before. It's more true today. Because today, the amount of tools you have to purchase, therefore the amount of money at stake, the amount of investment up front that's required to do all this, and to your point, Ashley, all the tools that have to talk to each other, and all that data that needs to be displayed in a functional, actionable way, that doesn't just happen. And so you need, more so than ever today, an experienced team that has done it before. And I mean that from every level. I mean that from an SDR level. I mean that from a sales development manager level to a director level to a RevOps level. I'm amazed at how many folks I've worked with in the past who have done a specific thing before, but haven't applied it to sales development. So this happens oftentimes in RevOps in IT, where you're trying to optimize Salesforce, and the perspective that they may have is more fitting towards CS, customer success, or closing. It's a whole different world dealing with SDR data operations. It is a whole different challenge. Folks who are appropriate for the role and have a lot of experience doing that thing. And one way to bring this to life is simple. I know today that if I send 100 emails, the reply rate's going to be not great. Much worse than it was before. I do need to make calls today now more than ever. I need to host events now more than ever. You need to hire someone who can do those things. It seems kind of obvious, but there's technical capacity. So I can talk to someone and be like, have you used a certain tool like Orem or Nooks? Those are power dialers before. They make many dials at a time. It's the love and hate of many sales development representatives. They might say yes. And then you start unpacking that further and you're like, what do you want out of your career? What do you want about, what do you want from the next, I know this is a cliche question, but from the next one or two steps or upgrades in your career? And then you start to hear red flags like, oh, I'm trying to figure it out. Oh, I was burned in these 3 SDR roles before because the activity mix was too aggressive. When you start to see red flags, you have to assume that every single red flag you encounter is going to manifest itself 100x once that person's in the seat. Because it will. I promise you it will. It does it every time. Every time. Um, and you have to understand and really unpack what those red flags are. So I gave one example. It's not psychologically being prepared for the role. It's, I did that thing before. So let's say you check the box of having a ton of experience in your career. Are you gassed? Are you over it? Are you above it? Unpacking that in a simple interview is not easy, but you can latch on to some of those red flags. And if you hear those red flags, I implore you to assume it's going to come out again 100x down the road. Maybe it's not a deal breaker, but oftentimes it should be. And then the last thing to wrap this up, I just talked about something that requires pattern recognition and tactics for mastery. There are a crap ton of SDRs on the market right now. Mm-hmm. You need expertise to get this right. Work with a professional. A professional can be a sales development leader who has done this before. It's something that I myself have always admired. My previous colleague, Lou Petrosi, who founded Inside Skill, that was the consultancy firm I worked for. He's a Sixth Sense. Sixth Sense.
Love me some Lou.
Oh my goodness. Well, he has this magical ability to like see around corners and feel people out. That skill, not everyone has. Very few people do. Work with an expert. He's one of them. I consider myself a fairly good measure of this as well. Work with folks who have done it before. Do not try to hire on your own. Why? Because I imagine you don't have endless funding to burn on mistakes. I imagine you want to get this right the first time so you don't have to process that someone out, which takes time, is toxic, and costs you an incredible amount of ramp and money. Do not cut corners when it comes to hiring. Pay them right, pay them well, be respectful to them, set aggressive expectations, but to your point, Ashley, do not blue sky them. Do not say, you're going to sell 30 of these things every year when you know it's not reasonable and it's more like 10. Do not blue sky them. They will back channel you. The good ones will back channel you. They will see right through you. And those A players will not work for you if you have a reputation for being everything from toxic to delusional. And I say that with love to anyone listening who's like, well, I need to understand what reasonable does look like. Yes, please do. Because it will save you growth. It will save you from the nightmare of having to fire a human being, which I don't care if you've done it 10 times before. It is not fun and it costs you a lot of money. So that's what we're trying to avoid, basically.